Now it's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation.
What are you people? On dope?
Where you can toke.
I inhale frequently.
Or you can talk.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
Or you can toke and talk.
10 federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
While we talk about toke on Toker Talk Radio.
So, by the way, when it comes to pot, if you're 40 years old, you live in a log cabin in Oregon, you got 12 giant pot plants in your backyard, have a ball.
Live from beautiful Portland, Oregon at Rolla J Studios.
Hey, this is great.
Just like cannabis.
Plus your calls live at 971-533-7111.
They're walking on their pants with their cap on backwards, listening to Enema Man and Snoopy Poop Dog.
What's to keep somebody from getting all potted up on weed and then getting behind the wheel? Gateway theory doesn't work. It's a reality.
Holland, is it real? Don't tease me.
We're locking up people that take a couple of puffs of marijuana, and the next thing you know, they got 10 years.
And now, here's your host, the guru of ganja graphics, the sultan of sativa statistics, and the worst nightmare of a reefer mad prohibitionist. A polite, perspicacious, productive pothead with a propensity for PowerPoint. Radical Russ Belville.
All right, welcome back, everybody. 4:02 here in beautiful Portland, Oregon. We've got 3 more shows left in the first half of the year before our 4th of July vacation. That's right, no show on Monday. We'll be driving down to the Cannabis Cup in Santa Rosa, California. And then next week, Monday through Friday, no shows because it's 4th of July week. And we always take the 4th of July week off here at 420 Radio. 4th of July week and Christmas week, we get a full week off because, damn it, I need a vacation too. Want to make a quick announcement of event happening in Ohio. The Dub Barn with Central Ohio Normal presents Farm on Fire, an electronic music festival, July 11th and 12th at Frontier Ranch. That's pretty cool. Weekend after 4th of July, an electronic music festival. $30 ticket includes parking and camping. And they're still looking for a few volunteers. You do get in free if you're a volunteer. You can get more info through Facebook. Gothic Prophet will post a Facebook link for you in the chat room if you're interested. Or you can just contact the Central Ohio Normal Facebook page or group, or just talk to Gothic Prophet. He'll get it all figured out for you. And remember, if you've got an event going on to promote marijuana legalization anywhere in the country, or the world for that matter, we're happy to promote it here at 420 Radio. Just send me an email or join us in the chat room. Let me know what's up. You can even call in at 971-533-7111 to promote the event. Pookie's got a question. What city in Ohio are we talking about, Gothic Prophet? Let us know in the chat room. Pataskala? Okay. All right, so returning back to this stoned driving rant that I just went on. Folks, that was a hard rant to write. I rewrote that article about 3 times today. Each time I came to a different conclusion. First time I wrote the article was, I wrote, here's what we're saying wrong about framing. Here's why we can't win on the breathalyzer issue and why we should retreat to fighting for higher limits. And I thought it through, all the way through, and just came to the conclusion that, you know what? We're at a point of diminishing returns here. That if we continue to try to fight any sort of roadside detection technology, we're going to be seen as irresponsible people who don't care about impaired driving. And that's going to hurt us more politically. So that was my first conclusion. I wrote it all up like that. I said, all right, let's give up on the, fighting the stone driving thing, even though we know we're right. Even though we know the science shows that, 5 nanograms or 10 nanograms doesn't show that we're impaired or whatever. That politically speaking, we're fucked. And if we continue to fight against any limit, we're all going to end up with 0 tolerance or 5 nanograms. That was my first write through. Then I reread the thing and I went, no, I don't know that we're there yet. I don't know that it's too late yet to turn this argument around. And so I rewrote the thing a second time with, here's what we should say. Here's how maybe we can turn the tide here, right? Is that we need to turn this away from the idea that the magic number we have for alcohol means that there's a magic number for everything. We need to start pointing out that alcohol is special in that regard. That unlike almost any other drug, alcohol is one of the few where we can show a dose-dependent relationship between use and impairment. One of the few drugs. We gotta point out that alcohol's special, that it's an exception, that we were lucky we were able to use something like a breathalyzer for alcohol because that's the way alcohol metabolizes. That's the way alcohol works. But again, getting us to that point is going to require a whole lot of backpedaling from the treat it like alcohol frame. Because that's what's got us. That's what got us here, right? Well, treat it like alcohol, treat it like alcohol. Regulate marijuana like alcohol. We should treat it like alcohol. And so the public went, great. Where's the alcohol breathalyzer? And then we went and tried to say, oh, well, treat it like alcohol except the breathalyzer part. Well, that doesn't work so well. But it could work if we could get that one big talking point into people's heads that marijuana ain't alcohol. Now, we've nibbled around the edges of it with marijuana is safer than alcohol. And we've gotten to the point where, at least half the people think that marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol. And about a quarter of the people think it's safer than alcohol. And that's good. But safer than still invites a comparison. It still puts marijuana and alcohol in the category of things that fuck you up and make you a bad driver. Now, marijuana is safer than that. Of the two substances that fuck you up and make you a bad driver, marijuana is less, but it still puts marijuana in that bin. It still puts it in that frame, right? We need to move away from marijuana is safer to marijuana is different. Marijuana is different than alcohol. Marijuana ain't alcohol. And the tools we've been using to deal with alcohol may not work for marijuana.
Elitist. Just like any other dishwashing, burger flipping, public school educated, self-employed, bar band, musician, National Guardsman, he's Radical Russ.
.420 Radio, your ticket to the Boston Freedom Rally. The Marijuana Business Association, or MJBA, are proud sponsors of the Russ Belville Show. It is the mission of the MJBA to establish integrity and legitimacy, create common market standards, provide market intelligence, and develop best ethical business practices for participants in the emerging legal marijuana industry, including commercial hemp, medical marijuana, and recreational marijuana for adults. Learn more about the Marijuana Business Association and visit mjba.net to join today. That's mjba.net. Hemp Beach TV, featuring Blazy and Max from the secret hemp beach in Florida, replaying Fridays at 12 Pacific on 420radio.org. The law offices of Omar Figueroa would like to remind you to stand up for your rights. If you are detained or arrested, treat law enforcement with respect and stand up for your rights by repeating, I respectfully invoke all of my legal and constitutional rights. I do not consent to any search and seizure. I want to remain silent, and I want to speak with my attorney. Please contact the law offices of Omar Figueroa at 415-489-0420 or 707-829-0215 or on the web at omarfigueroa.com.
I'm not very good at singing songs, but here's a try.
If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. Space is filled with a network of wormholes.
Welcome back back, everyone. That, of course, is Carl Sagan in the Symphony of Science, remixed by Melody Sheep, and part of our Electric Tuesday Daily Toker Tunes. Coming up later tonight, you'll get Electric Bob's Boogaloo in our Daily Toker Tunes, a full hour of electronic dance music. Make sure to check that out. Plus, we'll have our new Daily Toker Tune coming up at 20 after. Electric Bob will give us something new as a preview for tonight's show. All right, catching up on some of the chat in the chat room, and a very good point made by Speed Limit in our chat room with regard to these THC limit bills. And that is that it may not be so important what the THC limit is, so long as it's not per se. Now, let me explain the legalese for some folks that might not know what all that means, right? A per se law means that in and of itself is enough proof of your impairment. And that's what we've got for, drunk driving, right? If you're above a 0.08, you're a drunk driver. You could be Danica Patrick. You could be the best driver in the world. You could have been driving perfectly and the cop pulled you over for, a tail light. But if he gives you the breathalyzer and you're at 0.09, you're a drunk driver. It's per se. They don't need any other evidence. Now, that's what happened with Washington State. When it passed its legalization, is it made a 5 nanogram per se DUI law. And let's clear up another thing here before we get too deep into this. We are talking about active THC in blood. We are not talking about the piss test you had to take for the Army, or the piss test you had to take for your job, or the piss test you had to take on probation, and the limit was 15 or 50 or whatever it was. There's a whole different technology. The piss tests are testing marijuana metabolites, which indeed only show that you recently used pot, as recently as a week ago for some folks, right? And that doesn't prove shit, right? It doesn't prove anything about whether you were impaired. We are talking in these laws about active THC in the bloodstream, which is impairing. THC is the part that impairs you. And it's in the bloodstream. It's active. It's going right now. Now, how much does it impair you? That's kind of the sticking point, right? But we can't make the argument with the blood test like we made with the P test as well. We can't make the argument that says, well, all you're showing is that someone used it. Well, yeah, but with the blood test, we're showing that they used it recently enough that it's still in their system. So that shifts the debate from, whether or not it matters, whether or not it shows you're impaired or not, to whether it shows how impaired you were. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about these THC limits. Washington State passed one that was 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood, active THC. Now, the argument is, does that make you impaired? No. For most people, it does not. KIRO did that famous video where they showed 3 pot smokers, All Day Addie, who is a medical patient who smokes all day, every day, and showed up to the test 3 times the legal limit. All Day Addie drove just fine. At 3 times the limit, at 5 times the limit, at 9 times the limit, and even at 11 times the limit, it took her to get 0.56. I'm sorry, 56 nanograms, I should say. It took her up to 56 nanograms before the drug recognition officer who was watching her drive would say that she was borderline. 11 times the legal limit to get to borderline. When you're 11 times the legal limit for alcohol, you get to dead. Okay? You're not even impaired anymore. You'd be dead. And it wasn't just All Day Addie with her super medical tolerance. They took a look at Weekend Dylan, who was a recreational consumer, consumes on the weekends, works regular job during the day, on the weekends likes to smoke a joint. That guy was able to get 4 or 5 times above the legal limit and still drive fine. And it's not even the newbies. They took another guy, Blue Moon Jeff, who said he smokes maybe once a year. Camping or something, right? Maybe once a year. They got him stoned. He was able to drive fine above the limit. Now, he ended up driving slower, and more cautiously. But he wasn't the kind of driver that the drug recognition experts would say would be a dangerous driver out there. So all three of those folks, had they been pulled over for an equipment violation or whatever excuse, Grateful Dead sticker, long hair, piercings, dreadlocks, whatever the excuse is, if they'd have been pulled over, each one of them would have been convicted of being a stoned driver in Washington State when none of them were exhibiting any danger to themselves or anyone. But in Colorado, things went down differently. In Colorado, they passed legalization without any DUI changes. But the legislature had been trying for months, 3 or 4 or 5 different bills to pass a per se 5 nanogram limit. And they never succeeded. They finally succeeded in passing a limit of 5 nanograms, but only when they compromised and made it a permissible inference. Now here's the difference, right? Per se says, boop, 5 nanograms, guilty, go to jail. Permissible inference says, boop, 5 nanograms, aha, you might be too impaired to drive. But they still have to prove it in court. Permissible inference means the evidence of having more than 5 nanograms in your system is enough for us to assume that you were a stoned driver, but your defense attorney can try to prove you weren't. So in a sense, per se is like guilty, and permissible inference is like guilty until proven innocent. Kinda. And so Speed Limit makes the point in our chat room that the key here is to fight the per se part. We don't care if it's 5 nanograms or 10 nanograms or 20 or 50 or 100 or whatever the nanograms might be. Make it a permissible inference, and the science will allow our defense attorneys to prove people weren't impaired. The dash cams will show that people weren't impaired. The sobriety tests will show that people weren't impaired. The juries will refuse to convict people who weren't impaired, and the DAs will stop bringing charges over people that aren't impaired. And that's going to cause the next few legislatures to go, either we have to pass this per se, or we ought to revisit the situation and not pass anything at all. So that's a good point. There's got to be that room to argue, as he says, room to argue the issue of impairment. And if the other side was to come back on us on that and say, well, yeah, but alcohol DUIs are per se, that's where we go back to that frame of marijuana ain't alcohol. And we can agree with them. We can say, yeah, you're right. Alcohol is a per se DUI because alcohol's different than marijuana. Alcohol does give us a reliable way of showing someone was impaired based on their body chemistry. Now, I got to give you a little aside here. I'm actually against per se alcohol DUIs too. I think we ought to be giving alcohol users the same consideration they would ask from us. We say that we know when we're sober enough to be able to drive. I know some people who drink who drive just fine after they've drank. But if they were pulled over and blood tested or breathalyzered, they'd be drunk drivers. Now, there might be the pushback to saying, well, yeah, but alcohol does impair your judgment and cause you to overestimate your abilities, whereas marijuana tends to make you underestimate your abilities and you compensate by driving more carefully. So that's always a good point to bring back. But personally, I don't like any blood test, chemistry test whatsoever, piss test, breath test, skin test, saliva test, DNA test. I don't like any test that convicts us of crimes based on our bodily makeup. I think it should be based on our actions. Now, I guess the argument there would be you did the action of drinking and getting yourself impaired and getting behind the wheel. But if that becomes our logical standard, then we have to apply that to marijuana. And then the argument becomes less about whether or not we were impaired and more about whether we were responsible. And that's the direction I think our opponents want to take things, is to remove this. I mean, if I were them and wanted to win this, I'd move it away from the issue of impairment and into the issue of responsibility, because that's something we can test. That's what I'm saying. If a breathalyzer shows that you smoked pot within the past couple of hours, we've got to be able to defend that it's okay to smoke pot within a couple hours and then drive. If the issue's impairment, we can do that. If the issue's responsibility, we can't.
.420 Radio, freeing your mind 24 hours a day. Adam Hand of Handmade Apparel produces quality custom designs for t-shirts, hats, and other apparel. Handmade Apparel is the official design shop for 420 Radio among many clients who rely on Adam Hand for everything from short-run custom projects to full-run clothing lines. Visit handmadeapparel.biz to browse the selection of handmade gear or to get a personal quote for your own designs. Handmade Apparel, a proud supporter of 420radio.org.
Tokers, there's no good reason to get your dog stoned. While it might not harm them physically, imagine being a dog who already begs for treats all day, and then imagine that dog having the munchies. Not cool. Growing plants indoors can be a rewarding hobby, but electricity bills can go through the roof. Then you have to cool down all those big hot lights. It can drive a grower insane. With Lush LED lighting, you can solve many of these issues and double your rewards. Matt and his scientists have developed the perfect light for flowering plants with far less cost and heat. And the results? Very effective. Check out LushLEDlighting.com right now and tell them Radical Russ sent you.
Everyone knows music and marijuana go together, so let's wind up our 20 after break with the Russ Belville Show's Daily Toker Tunes, the best in pod-safe 420 music from around the web. Today is Electric Tuesday, featuring the latest in electronic dance music and other cutting-edge genres. Now, sit back and enjoy your Daily Toker Tunes.
Welcome back, 22 after the hour, and we'd normally be joined by Electric Bob at this segment, but no call in from Bob yet, although he has submitted a new tune for us, so we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we do, I want to remind you all that we'll have Electric Bob's Boogaloo coming up next at 5 o'clock, and it will be the replay of his most recent episode. Let's see, where is that? The Seasons Change, the guest mix episode that he did. And then at 8 o'clock, we'll have a brand new edition of Electric Bob's Boogaloo. And on the new edition, we're going back to episode 1, Deep Trance. So stay tuned for that. Actually, no, it looks like we're doing Deep Trance for both hours. So let's, we'll just update the lineup right there. So some deep trance music coming up 45 minutes straight. Episode 1 of the Boogaloo coming up at 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock tonight. All right, let's get to the music. This is a tune called Rocky. Enjoy.
420 Radio, your ticket to Seattle Hemp Fest. New Approach Oregon is a coalition of Oregon citizens who believe that treating marijuana use as a crime has failed, costing taxpayers millions in law enforcement resources. Our approach will regulate, tax, and legalize marijuana for adults in Oregon. We can move Oregon forward and create new revenue for critical services. Visit our website at newapproachoregon.com or our page on Facebook at New Approach Oregon. Thank you. Electric Bob's Boogaloo, the best in electronic dance and experimental music, every Tuesday at 5 and 8 Pacific on 420radio.org. When you are starting up a medical cannabis business, you want a fired-up lawyer who understands the needs of cannabis consumers. The law office of Lauren Vasquez is your fired-up lawyer for the cannabis industry. Visit her website, firedupLawyer.com, or call 1-855-MMJ-LAWS for more information. That's 855-665-5297 for Lauren Vasquez, your fired-up lawyer, or email fireduplawyer@gmail.com.
Well, that's always good advice, folks. Never trust a Klingon. Welcome back to Toker Talk Radio. Radical Russ hanging out here, half past the hour, and we got a great chat room going on here at Ustream. You can join it. Just go to 420radio.org. Look in the top right corner for the brightly colored buttons. There's one that says chat room. Actually, there's a bunch that say chat. You can try any one of them you like. Join our chat room just by typing into the message area. It'll prompt you for a login, and you can create an account on Ustream and chat with us every weekday. In fact, the chat room is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and many friendships have been made through our chat. It's also a great place to discuss the latest issues happening in your area, maybe get some information out that people might not have heard about in their neck of the woods. So we're all about communications here on 420radio.org. We are public radio for the marijuana reform community. So we encourage you to make use of all of these communications avenues we have for you. Our comment section, our chat room, our podcast. It's all about spreading information and spreading the growing truth about cannabis. So thanks for joining us. We have some news stories that we didn't get to in the 420 radio news that I would like to address now. There's this interesting one about, well, first of all, the retail stores opening on July 8th. This one we did cover in the news. Washington State supposedly going to open the first 20 or so of its 334 planned marijuana stores. The problem, or one of the problems, one of many problems involved here, is that Washington State didn't license the producers and growers first. So these 20 stores that open may not have enough product to last very long. Kind of reminiscent of what happened in Colorado, where the first stores that opened had to adjust some of their inventory, that a one-time transfer they could do of inventory from the medical side to supply the recreational side. And even then, they were hit with scarcity, limits for purchases. You know, you could only purchase an eighth at a time to try to keep their inventory. So that was a system where they could borrow from the medical side. Washington State, they're not going to be able to borrow from the medical side. The oldest licenses for the producers and growers were issued a couple months ago. So maybe if someone planted some short, grow time strains, there might be some harvest, but there's not going to be much. And so these retailers are talking about running out of product. We're talking about running out of product and having to jack the prices up. And I just worry about that because this first week, you're going to have your 4th of July week. And we all come back from 4th of July week. All the news organizations come back too. And it's summertime and most of your legislatures are out of session by now. Congress, Washington, D.C., not much happening there. July and August, you get your slow news days. There will be plenty of column inches and plenty of airtime to talk about what's happening with the rollout of legalized marijuana in Washington state. Now, this could turn out badly, and perhaps in turning out badly, turn out good for us. Work with me on this one. Imagine that Washington state marijuana legalization rolls out on July 8th. There's only 20 or so stores open statewide. So the couple that are in Spokane and the 3 or 4 that are in Seattle and the 1 or 2 that are in Vancouver and maybe one around the Tri-Cities area, right? Yakima, whatever. But imagine that they open up and there's this huge rush and there's national CNN vans and New York Times reporters and, big coverage and huge lines down the street of people waiting to buy weed, just like there were in Colorado. But then the follow-up reports getting to be about how these stores ran out of weed, how upset the customers were that there wasn't much selection. And those pictures, the pictures that will come out as people show off their first receipt from their first ever legal weed purchase. And people see, what? $25 a gram? People see, an eighth with, $20, $30 worth of taxes attached to it. And as this rolls out, perhaps it doesn't roll out so smoothly. Perhaps, there's stores that close because they ran out of inventory and there's more customers griping because the tax rates are so high. Then some of these media outlets start doing some due diligence and they start checking out the medical side and talking to customers there who said, yeah, I went and got my first legal eighth just so I could have the receipt, but it's so expensive, I went back to my dispensary. Or they find somebody who said, yeah, I was going to go to the legal pot shops, but I found it was so expensive that I discovered, hey, I've got a pain condition and I just went and got my medical card. And then they'll interview a few of the dealers, the black market dealers who say, yeah, it's not really, legalization really hasn't changed me much at all. The taxes are so high there that all my customers are still coming to me. And so maybe this rollout being foobarred by lack of enough inventory, too high of taxes, and a flourishing gray and black market, perhaps that all works in our favor. If we shape this right in our framing and our rhetoric about this, we can have 2 examples. We can say, all right, well, look at the Colorado example and how successful that was. Now look at the Washington example and see how it wasn't successful. What's the difference between the successful one and the unsuccessful one? Well, the successful one had a regulated medical marijuana system. The unsuccessful one didn't. So maybe legislators in other states who know, especially Western states who know legalization's on the horizon, maybe that pushes them to get into gear to regulating medical, wink, looking at you, California, with the idea that what they're doing for medical is just the ground, the beginnings of what's going to be their recreational market. Maybe that motivates these reticent legislators in California to want to come up with something that's statewide in coverage. And maybe some reporters look at some of the other differences and say, well, obviously one of the huge differences is Colorado just overtaxed weed, whereas Washington state really overtaxed weed. And maybe that becomes a narrative. And then we can say, see, for legalization to be successful, you can't overtax it. Maybe it also blunts the next group pushing for legalization from using overinflated revenue figures to try to push for legalization, right? Maybe we don't oversell it so much. And maybe as this legalization rolls out in Washington state, the taxes are too high. There's stores closing down because there's not enough selection, because there becomes a narrative of not allowing enough growing, of the restrictions on how you get licenses and how expensive licenses are in Washington state becomes a narrative of being an impediment to a successful legalization. And I want to see it bended that way. I want to see the rhetoric going that way. I want to see Washington State stand out as the example of what not to do. Because then we can show what was good about Colorado and make the precedent be that. We can show that there was a right way and there was a wrong way in certain aspects to legalizing marijuana. This is why it was so critical in 2012 that at least 2 legalizations passed. I was hoping all 3 would pass. I was hoping it would be legal here in Oregon too. But at least 2 legalizations had to pass so that there could be a compare and contrast. I really believe if only 1 legalization had passed, the feds wouldn't be giving the green light like they are now. They wouldn't be, well, let's see how it turns out. I think they would have come down much harder if only, say, Colorado had passed it. I think also that if only Colorado had passed legalization, there is no compare and contrast. We don't know whether what we did was the best way to do it. So that any problems that can be pointed to in Colorado then become the reasoning for making it more restrictive in the following states. Kind of like what happened with medical marijuana. But the fact that we got 2 of them passed, Washington and Colorado, allows us to see the worst in Washington compared to what we did in Colorado and say, yeah, let's not do it that way. Let's not overtax marijuana. That's way too high. Let's not prevent the businesses from forming in the way that is most advantageous to the market. And then any of the bad things that came out of Colorado can seem smaller in comparison. They can be seen as things that need to be tweaked in the next legalization, not necessarily more restricted. This is why, in Washington State, it was always tough with Washington State to try to support legalization, because I've always thought that legalization is 3-tiered. Sometimes people say, oh, that's not true legalization. So I ask, what do you think true legalization is? Well, true legalization is I've got pot plants in my backyard and I can smoke them and I can eat them and I can do whatever I want with them. And nobody really cares, right? No permits, no taxes, no nothing, right? That's true legalization, but that's a process and takes a while to get there. I think there's 3 tiers to legalization, though. Prime directives. Asimov's laws of robotics. Remember the robot series, with Isaac Asimov, and it basically said there was 3 laws of robotics, and every robot had to obey them hierarchically, right? Like the number 1 was a robot cannot harm or through inaction allow to come to harm a human being. Number 2 law was that a robot must obey the orders of a human being, except where to do so would violate law 1. And then law 3 was a robot must preserve itself, must have self-preservation, except where that would conflict with law 2 or law 1, right? So it's a hierarchical thing, right? Well, I think there's a kind of a thing like that with marijuana legalization. The number 1 thing in marijuana legalization is it must end the arrest and imprisonment of people who use marijuana. That's possession. People who use, because there isn't, there's not really a law against smoking marijuana. It's the possessing of it, that it doesn't matter if you smoke it or not. You're just holding on to it, you're busted, right? So there's the possession of marijuana must be legal, not decrimmed, not where it's still contraband, not where it's still fined, not where it's still an excuse for cops to fuck with you, right? Number 1, marijuana possession must be made legal. Number 2, marijuana cultivation must be made legal, except where marijuana cultivation would prevent us from achieving number 1. And then number 3, discrimination against marijuana users must end. And in that, I mean, discrimination in business, discrimination in employment, discrimination, under the law, except where number 3 would cause us to lose the home grow of number 2 or the possession of number 1. Well, if we looked at Colorado's legalization, it fulfilled number 1 and it fulfilled number 2 because it allowed people to grow at home. But it hasn't quite fulfilled number 3 because it does discriminate against cannabis consumers still, right? Colorado cannabis businesses aren't allowed to advertise like, say, a liquor store would be able to advertise, or a tobacco producer would be able to advertise. There's still a 5 nanogram permissible inference against cannabis consumers. There's still there's still P tests for work. You can still be fired for right? So still hasn't fulfilled number 3. So even Colorado's not, on its way to true legalization yet. It only fulfilled 1 and 2. Washington was tough for me because it only fulfilled number 1. Washington said, all right, well, possession's legal, but cultivation's still a crime, and we're still going to discriminate against you. In fact, we're going to add more discrimination by adding a per se 5 nanogram. That made it a real wobbler for me. And there was some time for a couple months with 502 where I had to decide whether or not it was worth supporting. And in the end, I decided it was worth supporting because it was so paramount that somebody finally legalize number 1, the possession part. So paramount, because once you ended marijuana being contraband, I could see all the things, the cascade that would create. Once possession is legal, marijuana is not contraband. When it's not contraband, cops can't fuck with you when they smell it. Drug dogs can't fuck with you if they smell it. The sight of a seed or a stem in your garbage is no longer a probable cause for a search warrant, right? All these things that became legal when you tackled number 1 were so important. It was all right to dismiss home grow and to add a 5 nanogram DUID. But that's in the context of 2012. That's in the context of we've got to break through and pass something. Now that 2 states are legal, Colorado and Washington are both legal, I think we may get to the point where not having home grow is enough of a deal breaker. And now we'll have to shape it correctly. It's going to take a lot of shaping to make that one work. You'd be looking at saying to some legislator or to some voters out there, that's okay, go ahead and keep arresting people for pot, because if they can't grow it at home, by God, they should still go to prison. We should keep things the way they are, right? They'll try to pry us out of home grow by saying, well, don't you want to stop the arrests and the disparate, treatment of African Americans? So long as they can buy it in a store, what's the problem? And then our only defense is the old Keith Stroup defense of, the only way we can make sure it's not overtaxed and that meets our standards is if we can grow it ourselves. But that's more an economic argument, not a civil justice argument. So, are we to that point yet? If 502 came up again today in some other state, something exactly like it, I probably wouldn't be as supportive. I don't know that I would support it necessarily. Although it depends. If we're talking Texas, we're talking Arkansas, legalizing an ounce possession and no home grow sounds like a pretty good deal. But if we're talking Oregon, California, Rhode Island, Maine, no. If you're in one of these states that's already medical and very supportive of weed, there's no reason to give up on the home grow. If you're in one of the red states going for legalization, well, then maybe 502 is the kind of thing that would pass. It's a lot to think about. There's no simple answers to all of this stuff, but that's why we're here every weekday, 3 to 5, talking it out.
America's R7 secret agent of progressive change.
The name's Belville. Russ Belville.
This is the Russ Belville Show.
Goldfinger, he's the man with the Midas touch, a spider's touch, such a cold finger beckons you to enter his web of sin. But don't go in. Golden words he will pour in your ear.
420 Radio, your ticket to the High Times Cannabis Cups.
The Pistachio. Green, natural, and available without prescription in all 50 states. He's fine.
Hey, this is Willie Nelson for Normal. I smoke pot and I like it a lot. I learned a long time ago that marijuana is a lot safer than alcohol. There's nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. It's time we stopped arresting and started respecting those who smoke marijuana responsibly. To learn what you can do to help, contact Normal at NORML.org or call toll-free 888.
The pistachio. Green, natural, and available without prescription in all 50 states. He's fine.
Welcome back, everybody. 49 after the hour. That's Titanos with Marijuana. That's some of the electronic music you'll get here. We got some trance music coming up for you next at 5 p.m. on Electric Bob's Boogaloo. All right, so looking at some other news, this is the story I wanted to get to, which was that the FDA is going to evaluate marijuana for potential reclassification as a less dangerous drug. So we'll check this out here. According to Huffington Post, the FDA is reviewing medical evidence surrounding the safety and effectiveness of marijuana. FDA press officer described the review process, which is being completed at the request of the DEA. So the DEA has asked the FDA to review marijuana. And FDA conducts a scientific and medical analysis, recommends to the DEA where it should go on the drug schedules. DEA conducts its own assessment and then makes a final scheduling proposal. So guess how that turns out, folks? DEA will just come back and say it still belongs in Schedule 1. See, this is the trap of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. When it comes to the evaluation of the drugs in question, while the science about the drugs has something to do with it, the way the laws are written is that the DEA gets to determine whether its analysis of the science is accurate. The DEA is its own arbiter of whether the DEA was right in its analysis of the science. This is the roadblock that Normal and MAPS and ASA have all run into in their 3 different lawsuits against the DEA for the rescheduling of marijuana. Because we all go, well, guys, Schedule 1 says it's got no accepted medical use in the United States, and there's now 23 states that have accepted medical use. And all they have to come back and say is, yeah, but there's no accepted medical use in the United States. And I know that sounds immature, and it sounds like it can't be that stupid, but it is that stupid. That's all they have to do. La, 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 we don't hear you. There's no accepted use in the United States. So anyway, FDA is supposedly going to be conducting this thorough scientific and medical analysis with no deadline. They wouldn't confirm how long the review process would take, right? So maybe some of this has to do with whether or not, maybe some of this has to do with just a stall tactic, a delay, if you will. And the stall here, I think, is around GW Pharmaceuticals trying to get Sativex and Epidiolex perfected and through their FDA trials. Because then they can just use that to replace, the oils in the dispensaries, especially these East Coast states that don't have home grow. Oh, you need a CBD oil for your kid who has epilepsy? Why, here's Epidiolex from GW Pharmaceuticals. So I think this FDA confirmation thing could just be maybe a stall tactic. But it is still nice to know that they will be considering it. There is supposedly an 8-factor analysis to assess whether or not marijuana or any drug is a drug of abuse. So here are the 8 steps. Here are the 8 factors. Number 1, its actual or relative potential for abuse. Number 2, scientific evidence of its pharmacological effect, if known. Number 3, the state of current scientific knowledge regarding the drug or other substance. Number 4, its history and current pattern of abuse. Number 5, the scope, duration, and significance of abuse. Number 6, what, if any, risk there is to the public health. Number 7, its psychic or physiological dependence liability. And number 8, whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance already controlled under this subchapter. All right, so, and really the DEA is asking for this. So I mentioned it might have been something about a stall tactic, but it's forced to do this because 2 public citizens' petitions asked the agency for a review. So, of these 8 factors, here's a few things that I could point out. Number 1, about its actual or relative potential for abuse. Number 4, history and current pattern of abuse. Number 5, scope, duration, and significance of abuse. All 3 of those depend on what you consider abuse. In the federal government's definition of abuse, it is use. If you use marijuana, you abuse marijuana. Under their definition, there is no use for marijuana. There is only abuse of marijuana. So if they go with number 1, actual potential for abuse, all they got to do is say, look, there's 28 million people in this country that use marijuana every year. That's a drug being abused by 8% of the population. When really it's being used by 8% of the population. History and current pattern. They can show abuse of marijuana going all the way back to, Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong. I mean, because they consider all use abuse. Scope, duration, and significance. Well, they can show that the scope has grown. Since 2007, there's been a 20% increase in the number of people who admit to using marijuana every year. The scope has grown. The duration has lasted for over a century. And the significance? Well, then they would just point to, look how much it's infiltrated our culture. Look at all the references on television now to marijuana and people joking about getting high on marijuana. Why, Stephen Colbert has an American bald eagle getting high on marijuana. So there's already 3 of the 8 that aren't really a fair evaluation because all use is defined as abuse. Now, if they want to go with number 2, the scientific evidence of pharmacological effect, that helps us because the scientific evidence shows that, it's very medical for many people and it's very little harm to most others. A lot of people like to use it and everyone that uses it has very little harm. And number 3, the state of current scientific knowledge. Great, let's go with that. We're all for that as well. Risk, if any, to public health. This is where they'll try to point to, traffic accidents or schizophrenia or whatever else. Which shouldn't help them any because traffic fatalities have been going down steadily for 30 years, even as marijuana use has gone up for 30 years. How schizophrenia has remained stable for a century, even as marijuana use has grown quite a bit. This number 7, it's psychic or physiological dependence liability. The psychic dependence liability. I like that. This is just about how much if you use it, it messes up your life, right? Well, if we're going to go with actual fact here, this would help us in this evaluation. NIDA itself lists the withdrawal characteristics of cannabis as very similar to the withdrawal characteristics of caffeine. Nobody's ever talked about scheduling caffeine. And then the number 8 one, whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance already controlled under the subchapter, that doesn't really apply with marijuana. It might apply if we were talking about opium that could be made into heroin, right? A precursor substance. Now, this is not the first time, like we mentioned, that there have been attacks on the scheduling of marijuana. There's a petition in 2001, a petition in 2006. Both times, federal regulators determined that marijuana should remain a Schedule I substance. At the time, FDA said there was simply not enough research about marijuana's efficacy in treating various ailments. Well, it's 8 years later. Let's hope that there's more research. But the problem is the research is all controlled by NIDA, which has only conducted about 30 studies on the benefits of marijuana. Since 2003, it's approved about 500 grants for marijuana-related studies. But they only fund the marijuana research studies that focus on the negative effects of marijuana. But there may be enough evidence now. There may be enough studies now. And with the growing public sentiment for legalization, that they really just have to move on this. It's my hope that the FDA comes back with a recommendation to move marijuana into Schedule 3, where Marinol and Sesamet and those kind of things are. If synthetic THC in a pill is Schedule 3, then natural THC in a bud's got to be Schedule 3 at least. Technically, it shouldn't even be on the schedule, but, baby steps. We'll get there. That's all the time we got. Stay tuned for Electric Bob's Boogaloo. Coming up next, I'm Radical Russ for Priscilla Simon. Thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow, and until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you